In the forgotten boroughs of Tower Hamlets, where peeling walls tell stories of hardship, millionaire James Whitmore entered a crumbling house by mistake whilst seeking shelter from the November rain. In the darkest corner, an 8-year-old girl was sewing by flickering candlelight, her small hands trembling from the cold as she embroidered a piece of fabric. When he asked what she was doing, the little one raised her weary eyes and replied with devastating matter-of-factness, "I'm sewing sachets for the shop. If I finish 10 tonight, tomorrow we'll have rice for dinner." The stone heart of the millionaire shattered in that moment. He didn't yet know that this girl, Rose, would forever change the course of two lives intertwined by fate. November rain lashed London with unusual fury that evening. It wasn't the London of tourist postcards, but the real and harsh Tower Hamlets, where hope dies young between muddy alleyways and derelict houses. Water transformed the streets into torrents, whilst the sky unleashed its rage upon corrugated iron roofs. James Whitmore, 52 years of success built upon solitude, silently cursed the Bentley that had betrayed him precisely in this God-forsaken neighborhood. His chauffeur had rushed off to seek help, leaving him alone in a territory he had only ever observed through the bulletproof windows of his luxury motor cars. The 5,000-pound suit soaked through whilst he desperately searched for shelter. The half-open door of the inhabited ruin appeared like a mirage. Without thinking, he slipped inside. The impact with poverty was violent. The smell of damp and desperation struck him whilst his eyes, accustomed to marble and crystal, struggled to adapt to the darkness. That's when he saw her. In the most remote corner, where the rainwater hadn't yet reached, a girl sat upon an upturned crate. Barely 8 years old, dirty blonde hair tied back as best she could manage. A dress that was more patches than original fabric. But it was her hands that captivated James. Small hands moving with surgical precision, guiding a needle through white fabric in the trembling light of a dying candle. The girl hadn't noticed the intruder, completely absorbed in her work. Beside her, a pile of already completed sachets testified to hours of labor. James remained paralyzed before this scene from a bygone century. In 2023, in the heart of Britain, a child was working as in the 19th century. Thunder broke the spell. The little one looked up and, instead of being frightened, tilted her head with innocent curiosity. Her thin but firm voice asked if he was lost. James, suddenly conscious of the grotesque contrast between his soaked luxury and this dry poverty, stammered something about the rain and the broken-down car. The girl nodded with the naturalness of one accustomed to the absurd and returned to her work. The needle went in and out hypnotically, whilst James, drawn by a force he couldn't explain, cautiously approached. "They were sachets for the spice shop," she explained without looking up. 10 sachets, 50 pence each, £5 for hours of meticulous work. James felt something break inside him, whilst the girl listed with detachment her various jobs: sachets, embroidery, buttons, according to need. At the question about school, for the first time the small hands stopped. The look she gave him had seen too much for those 8 years. School was a luxury for those who could afford books, shoes, the privilege of not working to eat. The silence that followed weighed like a millstone, whilst James absorbed the details of what could generously be called a home. A mattress in the corner covered with rags, a crate as a table, no sign of modern civilization, neither water nor electricity nor heating. The girl lived with her mother, who cleaned offices at night, returning at dawn. Rose, this was her name that James would treasure like gold, resumed sewing with nimble fingers despite the cold that must have numbed them. 4 remained, she said, when he asked. If she finished them before midnight, the next day they'd have money for rice. Perhaps some oil, too, she added with that timid hope of one who dares not ask too much of life. It was that phrase, spoken with the naturalness of one who knows no alternative, that definitively broke James Whitmore. The man who had built empires without ever wavering felt his eyes burn with never-shed tears. An 8-year-old girl sewing through the night to earn her rice. In his London, in his 2023, he sat heavily upon a crate, not caring about the already ruined suit. Rose looked at him perplexed when he asked if he could help. Did he know how to sew by any chance? The almost laugh that escaped him was bitter. No, he couldn't sew, but he could keep her company. Tell her a story. The girl's eyes lit up like stars. A story? She hadn't heard one since Daddy. The sentence died unspoken but heavy in the damp air. Thus James began to tell of brave princesses and kingdoms to be saved, whilst Rose sewed, a small smile appearing and disappearing on the tired little face. 2 hours later, when the chauffeur found him, he was still there, watching over a girl finishing the last sachet of the evening. Before leaving, he emptied his pockets of all the cash he had, placing it silently, whilst Rose had fallen asleep, with the needle still in her hand. But as the Bentley returned him to his golden world, James knew that something had broken and recomposed itself differently within him. The image of those small hands sewing for rice would never leave him again. But James Whitmore wasn't the type to be tormented by ghosts. He was the type to confront them. 3 sleepless nights later, James returned to Tower Hamlets with a determination that frightened even his chauffeur. It was no longer chance, but mission. He had researched, discovering figures that had sickened him. Thousands of British children below the poverty line, many forced to work. But it wasn't the statistics that obsessed him. It was a specific face, 2 specific hands, 1 specific story. When he knocked on the crooked door, it was Margaret who opened. 30 years that looked like 50. The same eyes as Rose, but extinguished by too much life. She regarded him with the suspicion of one who has learned that nothing good ever comes from the rich. James introduced himself, mentioned the encounter with Rose. Margaret noticed the money still untouched on the table. They didn't accept charity, she said, with a pride that cost dearly. It wasn't charity, he protested. It was gratitude for the shelter, for the stories heard. Rose emerged from the darkness like a small ghost, her face lighting up upon recognizing him. The story, gentlemen. The maternal suspicion softened imperceptibly, seeing the genuine joy of her daughter. James formulated his proposal carefully. Not charity. Work. He was seeking staff for cleaning in his company. Day shifts, proper contract, national insurance, and a company nursery where Rose could stay and then go to school. Not charity, but opportunity. The silence that followed was thick with suspicion. Margaret searched for the trick, the hidden price that the rich always demanded. Why? The simple question required a complex answer. James chose truth. He had built an empire, but had no one to share it with. He had lived 52 years without seeing the real city in which he dwelt, and a girl who sewed for rice had opened his eyes to what was unacceptable, inhumane. Margaret continued studying him. What did he want in return? Nothing, he replied. Just to know that Rose went to school instead of sewing through the night. It was the girl who broke the impasse. With the disarming logic of innocence, she took her mother's hand and declared that Mr. James was good. She could sense it. Margaret promised to think about it, took the business card with slightly trembling hands. 2 days later, the telephone rang. Margaret's voice was uncertain, but determined. She was ready to see this company. The first day at Whitmore Industries was an ordeal for both. Margaret, punctual and willing, faced the suspicious glances of colleagues who smelled nepotism. Rose in the company nursery looked like a small fish in an ocean of well-dressed sharks. The other children with their designer rucksacks and elaborate packed lunches, whilst she clutched the little fabric bag she had sewn, containing only bread. From high in his office, James observed through the cameras, his social experiment failing miserably. He had underestimated the cruelty of the world, which didn't reside only in poverty, but also in the merciless judgment of those better off. Seeing Rose eating alone in a corner spurred him to action. He descended from his Olympus, creating commotion among employees unaccustomed to seeing him in the lower echelons of the company. He entered the nursery and called Rose, who brightened upon seeing him. He produced 2 Chelsea buns. Rose's eyes widened as if before treasure. They sat together whilst he told of his poor childhood, of his fisherman father in Cornwall, of hungry nights when the sea was stingy. Rose listened incredulously. Had he been poor too? The revelation attracted other children, curious. James skillfully transformed Rose's shame into pride. She was an artist with needle and thread, could make extraordinary things. Within minutes, the girl found herself surrounded by fascinated peers, the ice broken by childish curiosity. In the cleaning department, meanwhile, James interrupted the chorus of malicious whispers. He announced loudly that Mrs. Thompson had wasted skills. She knew about bookkeeping, had experience. From tomorrow, she would be trained as an accounts assistant. Same starting salary, but possibilities for advancement. The stunned silence was music to his ears. Anyone with problems regarding his decisions could address him directly, he added, in a tone that brooked no argument. 6 months later, the transformation was complete. Rose regularly attended school, had friends, laughed. She no longer sewed through the night, but drew and played. Margaret had proved excellent in her new role, promoted twice on pure merit. But the most profound transformation was James's. The weekly lunches with them had become the appointment he anticipated with greatest eagerness. The girl who had sewn for rice had opened a crack in the wall around his heart, a crack that widened each day. It was during one of those lunches that Rose, with the devastating frankness of children, declared that James was sad. He had sad eyes like Mummy when Daddy had died. Cornered by childish truth, James confessed, he had everything, but he had nothing. Houses, companies, bank accounts. But he returned each evening to an empty house, with no one to tell about his day, without family. The silence that followed was broken by Rose, who stood up, walked around the table and embraced him. A small but powerful embrace, followed by simple words. Now he had a family. They were his family. Fate tested this new family when Margaret collapsed from stress accumulated over years of deprivation. James received the call at the office and rushed to the hospital like a madman, finding Rose small and frightened in the waiting room. The girl ran into his arms, whispering her fear. He promised he was there, that he would always be there. And at that moment, he understood it was true. During Margaret's convalescence, Rose stayed in James's mansion. The always empty and silent dwelling suddenly filled with life. Laughter, running, drawings stuck everywhere. The domestic staff, initially scandalized, fell in love with the little one who brought sunshine to this house of shadows. James discovered what it meant to be a father. Evenings were no longer devoted to work, but to homework, stories, chess. Rose taught him to live whilst he taught her the world. One evening, tucking her in, he revealed that he had understood who the princess of his stories was. It was her, Rose, who had saved his empty kingdom. When Margaret recovered, James made the proposal he had been contemplating for weeks. He wanted them to move permanently into the mansion. It wasn't charity, but necessity. 20 empty rooms were a scandal. They needed stability. He needed them. It was family, he insisted, when Margaret protested. The word resonated in the drawing room like a promise and a challenge. Rose intervened with her disarming logic. Everyone had been alone before. Together, they weren't anymore. The simplicity of truth convinced Margaret more than any speech. She set her conditions. She would continue working, pay symbolic rent, maintain her independence. James accepted everything, too happy to argue details. The mansion transformed. Silent corridors echoed with life. the sterile kitchen filled with the aroma of Sunday roast. The perfect garden welcomed swings and improvised vegetable patches. James also changed at work, instituting assistance programs for employees in difficulty, scholarships, company nurseries everywhere. A year after that first encounter, on a summer evening sitting in the garden whilst Rose played, James found courage. He confessed to having fallen in love with Margaret. She didn't seem surprised. Rose had told her months earlier, noticing his heart eyes. Despite the tension, they both laughed at the childish perception.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
The real question was what to do with this feeling. James had no elaborate answers, only simple certainties. They had made his life worthy. He didn't want to lose them. He wanted to wake each morning knowing they were there. Margaret took his hand with a gesture worth more than 1,000 words. They would go slowly, for Rose, for them, but there was a future to explore together. 2 years later, the mansion's chapel hosted a wedding none of the attendees would ever forget. Not for the splendor, Margaret had insisted on an intimate ceremony, but for the palpable emotion that permeated every moment. Rose, now 10 years old, carried the rings with the solemnity of one who knows she had been the invisible architect of this union. It was she who had seen beyond social barriers, beyond abyssal differences, uniting two solitudes into a family no one could have imagined. The girl wore a hand-embroidered dress. She had wanted to sew it herself, with help from London's most skilled seamstresses, whom James had summoned. But in some places one could see her stitches, slightly irregular but charged with love. It was her way of honoring the past whilst embracing the future. James had insisted on legally adopting Rose before the wedding. The papers had been ready for months, but it was the girl who posed an unexpected condition that moved everyone. She wanted to keep her dead father's surname alongside the new one. Thus, she became Rose Thompson Whitmore, living bridge between the past of pain and the future of hope, between the father who had loved her and left too soon, and the one who had chosen her and would remain. The transformation of the Whitmore empire had been radical and systematic. Every company in the group now boasted revolutionary programs supporting families in difficulty. Not disguised charity, but concrete opportunities. Free company nurseries, complete scholarships, interest-free loans for family emergencies, training programs for single mothers. The Rose Foundation, a name chosen by James against the girl's embarrassed protests, had become a beacon of hope for thousands of families. It didn't limit itself to distributing money, but created pathways of rebirth, workshops where desperate mothers learned trades, study centers where children like Rose had been could study instead of work, canteens guaranteeing at least one hot meal daily. But the true miracle, the one no financial newspaper could capture in its analyses, occurred each evening between the walls of that no longer empty mansion. James returned punctually at 6, he who had previously lived at the office, to find scenes of extraordinary normality. Margaret at the stove preparing simple but lovingly made dinners, Rose doing homework at the large kitchen table instead of in her room because, "I like hearing the sounds of family." They dined together, recounting the day in minute detail. James discovered the pleasure of listening to Rose's small school dramas, Margaret's professional conquests, who had become administrative director. They listened to his business battles, now increasingly socially oriented, offering him perspectives his previous life had never allowed him to see. Weekends were sacred. No work commitments, only family. Seaside escapes in winter when beaches were deserted and Rose could run free. Museum visits where the girl astonished guides with sharp questions. But above all, regular returns to Tower Hamlets, for Rose had imposed an iron rule: never forget where they came from. During these returns, James saw his adoptive daughter transform. In rich neighborhoods, she was a normal girl, lively but composed. In Tower Hamlets, she became a small general, organizing distributions of clothes and food, dragging her father among needy families, translating their reality into concrete actions he could implement. "Papa," she told him one day whilst they visited a family with 3 children in one room, "you have the money, but I have the eyes. I see what's really needed because I've been there. Together we can work miracles." And miracles they worked, like when they transformed an abandoned warehouse into a center where mothers could leave children whilst they worked, with volunteers who helped with homework and taught trades. Or when they created a microcredit program allowing families to start small businesses without falling into usurers' hands. Rose grew brilliant, but with feet firmly on the ground. At school, she excelled in all subjects, but her true passion remained sewing. Not from necessity now, but as art. Her hands, which had once trembled from cold whilst sewing to survive, now created beauty for the joy of creating. She taught sewing to classmates at the study center, patient with those lacking her natural dexterity. She organized charity markets where they sold their creations, donating everything to the foundation. The mothers of classmates, initially snobbish towards this upstart, ended up conquered by her genuineness and the depth hidden beneath childish appearance. It was on an autumn evening, 5 years after that first encounter, that the moment crystallizing the entire journey occurred. James and Margaret found Rose in her room, bent over something in the light of the desk lamp. For one terrible instant, James relived that first night. The candle, the cold, the despair. But when Rose looked up, she was smiling radiantly. She was embroidering their intertwined initials on finest linen handkerchief. J, M, and R united in an elegant motif she had designed herself. The girl stood and offered the handkerchief to James with solemn gesture. He noticed she had chosen to work by lamplight instead of switching on the overhead light, and understood. It was her way of honoring the past whilst celebrating the present. "I know you have drawers full of expensive handkerchiefs," said Rose, with that mixture of seriousness and irony she had perfected whilst growing up. "But this one is different. When I sewed for rice, every stitch was survival. Now every stitch is love. It's my way of saying thank you for saving me." "You're mistaken," replied James, with voice broken by emotion, clutching the handkerchief like the treasure it was. "It was you who saved me." That handkerchief became his talisman. He always carried it with him, to every important meeting, in every difficult moment. When journalists asked him to show the symbol of his success, he would produce this simple embroidered square of cloth. There lay his true wealth. Years passed swiftly like pages of a book turned by wind. Rose shone at university, graduating in economics with a revolutionary thesis on social enterprise and child poverty reduction, the Rose Foundation model. She rejected offers from prestigious multinationals to assume operational direction of the foundation, transforming it into a model studied and replicated throughout Europe. Margaret, for her part, had become one of the most respected managers in the Whitmore Group. Her ability to see beyond numbers, to understand people behind statistics, had revolutionized the way of doing business. But her true pride remained the family she had built from despair's ashes. When financial newspapers interviewed billionaire philanthropist James Whitmore, now 70 but still energetic, asking the secret of his extraordinary transformation, he always told the same story. A rainy night, a door opened by chance, a girl who sewed for rice. "Money is merely paper if it doesn't serve to change lives," he would say, the embroidered handkerchief always visible in his jacket pocket. "I had to encounter true poverty to understand true wealth. I had to see a girl work to eat to understand that my work made no sense if it didn't serve to prevent other girls having to do the same." During these interviews, Rose always sat beside him. Now in her 30s, herself mother of 2 children growing up aware but not crushed by privilege, she led the foundation with firm hand and open heart. She had married Oliver, A doctor met during a foundation mission in difficult neighborhoods, a man who shared her vision of a more just world. Margaret preferred to remain behind the scenes, but her serene smile said more than 1,000 words. The woman who had mistrusted that man too rich to be true, now aged beside him, companion of a life neither had dared dream. James's mansion had become much more than a home. It was a nerve center of social change. In the drawing room, where once only silence echoed, foundation meetings now took place. In the garden, where previously only ornamental roses grew, flourished a vegetable patch cultivated by neighborhood children who came to learn. Each year, on the anniversary of that rainy night, the family returned to that house in Tower Hamlets, now transformed into a community center. Rose insisted on sitting in that same corner, now lit and heated, to tell her story to neighborhood children. "Look," she would say, showing her hands, the same that had sewn to survive. "These hands have done two things in life. Before they sewed from necessity, now they sew from love. But it was the first that made the second possible. Never be ashamed of where you come from. Use it as strength to reach where you want to go." The children listened spellbound, seeing in her not the wealthy foundation director, but the girl she had been, that she still was in some sense. And among them, always, were children who sewed, or cleaned, or did any work to survive. History repeated itself, but now there was someone ready to break the cycle. One day, already aged and ill, James called Rose to his bedside. He took her hands, those hands he had seen tremble from cold the first time, and gave her the embroidered handkerchief. "I've carried it with me every day," he whispered. "Now it's your turn to carry it. And remember." "Remember what, Papa?" "That miracles are born in the darkest places, that the faintest light can illuminate the path, that a girl who sews for rice can save a man who had everything except what matters." Rose wept, holding those hands that had lifted her from the abyss. She promised she would remember, that she would continue, that every child sewing in shadow would have their chance at light. James died peacefully, surrounded by the family fate had given him in exchange for his golden solitude. At the funeral, thousands came to pay homage not to the millionaire, but to the man who had understood that true wealth is measured in changed lives. Rose spoke at the funeral with firm voice, despite tears. She told once more the story of that night, of the rain-soaked man who had found shelter and offered a future in return, of the handkerchief she now carried, symbol of love that had transformed destinies. "My father taught me many things," she concluded, "but the most important is this: no matter how high you rise, never forget the ground you came from, for it is there, in mud and despair, that the most beautiful flowers are born. I was one of those flowers, and thanks to him, I was able to bloom." The Rose Foundation continued growing, becoming an empire of good that rivaled the economic empire that had generated it. But at its heart always remained that simple and devastating truth: a girl who sewed for rice, a man who had the courage to see beyond, and the love that had transformed them both. On rainy nights, when wind howled and the world seemed cruel, Rose would take out the handkerchief and look at it. Every stitch reminded her of the journey, from despair to hope, from hunger to abundance, from solitude to family. And somewhere, in some dark corner of some city, another girl was sewing to survive. But now there was a network ready to catch her, created by one who had walked that path and promised no other child would have to walk it alone. The circle had closed, but like every self-respecting circle, it was also the beginning of something new. The legacy of that rainy night continued spreading, wave after wave, saving lives that would in turn save others. For this is love's true magic. It doesn't exhaust itself in giving, but multiplies, like the stitches of embroidery that, one after another, create beauty from nothing. Like a girl who sewed for rice and ended up embroidering destinies. If this story has touched your heart, leave a like. Share in the comments. Have you ever seen how a small gesture can change destinies? Do you know stories of redemption that have transformed lives? Subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss other stories proving that love can be born in the most unlikely places. Remember, sometimes it's enough to open a door, extend a hand, see beyond appearances to create miracles. The girl sewing in shadow might be the light you were seeking.